This is our final session of the day, eagerly awaited look at what has happened in Wisconsin during this busy presidential and U.S. Senate and state legislative elections. And I want to introduce my colleague from the La Follette School of Public Affairs, Amber Wachowski, to introduce our presenter.
All right, thank you so much for sticking around. I'm so excited to introduce Charles Franklin, who will be bringing us home, both in terms of the program, but also with a focus on our state. Charles Franklin is a nationally recognized government scholar and pollster. He's been director of the Marquette Law School poll since its inception in 2012. And he's also a full-time member of the Marquette Law School. Franklin led the law school poll during the highly scrutinized 2012 election cycle, establishing the Marquette Law School poll as the definitive source of information concerning public opinion in Wisconsin. Under Franklin's direction, the poll became the largest independent polling project in state history. It accurately captured voter attitudes before every major election in 2012 and so many in the years afterwards, including the gubernatorial recall, as well as U.S. Senate elections. Please join me in welcoming Charles Franklin to the stage.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you all. Why are you still here? Really hearty band here of strong Midwesterners. So I am going to talk a little bit about voting returns and what happened here in Wisconsin. We'll touch on polling a little bit later, but I want to run down what we know about the vote as opposed to the polls about the vote. So that's the game plan. Barry already put this chart up, so I don't really need to leave it up. It's the Electoral College win, and of course it shows the sweep of the 7 swing states, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, and then here in the Great Lakes, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the greatest Great Lakes state, Wisconsin. And for the three of us up here, the Great Lakes states, voted for Obama twice, voted for Trump, voted for Biden, voted for Trump again. We all seem to swing in the same direction, even if by very narrow margins in the races. Speaking of narrow margins, so you have a little bit of historical perspective, here are the elections since 1856. You see that this latest one, the red dot at the far right, is quite a close race. At the time I updated this chart yesterday, it's a 1.6 something percentage point lead for Trump nationwide. There are still some votes to come in that may narrow that even a little bit slightly, but I think it's pretty close. The thing I want to point out is if you look at the last 8 elections since 2000, 7 elections since 2000, how close they have been. And maybe arguably the 2 elections in the 90s were close as well. Prior to that, we rarely had a long string of very close elections. You see a period when Nixon wins big, when Reagan wins big, followed by George H.W. Bush winning by a pretty fair margin. You see a period of Democratic dominance, then Republican dominance, then Democrats again. You have to go all the way back to the 1870s through the 1890s to see the only string in our, at least post-Civil War history, where the races have been decided nationally by such narrow margins. And I don't see anything in this year's results to suggest we're going to push off of that equilibrium. The amount of change from last election to this election is really quite small. One nice thing when you're going last is you see what everybody else has put up. I'm pretty pleased to say that I don't think our conclusions differ from one another very much at all. We show them in slightly different ways, but the big takeaway of this is a broad victory for Trump, but it's not very deep. The margin remains quite tight. And there have been pieces written this week about it wasn't a landslide, even though it was called a landslide earlier. I think that's exactly right. This was a close and profound election because giving the presidency to one party and to the House and to the Senate, that's big consequences. And Lynn was talking about that earlier. But it's not because the electorate swung mightily in one direction or another. Again, you've seen this map around from the New York Times, and this is kind of an old map. So some of those gray areas out west are gray because the votes weren't in at the time they did this map. That doesn't really matter. The point is the overall picture of the red arrows pointing to the northeast, showing the swing in Trump's direction. The very few blue arrows, the one that stands out actually is the Atlanta area, the suburban counties around Atlanta. But otherwise, this was a widespread shift in a Republican direction. But in general, those arrows aren't very long. None of the states really, or the counties really shifted dramatically. So here's another way to look at that. You see on the bottom, the Republican minus the Democratic margin in 2020. This is for every county, all 3,500 counties in the country. And on the vertical axis is the margin this year. That red diagonal line is if the county voted exactly the same this time as they did 4 years ago. If the dot is above that line, then they moved in a Republican direction. If it's below the line, they moved in a Democratic direction. And lastly, the size of the circles is proportional to the number of votes cast, the total number of votes in that county. So you see a couple of really big bubbles. That's like LA County, for example. But it's just obvious that all of this movement, or the vast majority of the counties, moved in Trump's direction. In fact, 89% of the counties shifted in Trump's direction. Not by a whole lot, though. Where they shifted a little bit more is in counties that had been more Democratic last time. Some of those Trump made bigger gains in. In the counties that had been solidly Republican last time, he made modest gains, though consistent gains. They just weren't big gains there. So a little bit of a loss of support in Democratic leaning areas. You've seen it in the state maps talking about the New Jersey vote shifting, for example, but that applies here at the county level as well. Another way to look at that was the percentage margin. What about voter turnout? So this is Bernard's talk that I'm not quite stealing from, but we're getting to the same point. On the left is the total number of votes cast for the Democratic candidate. On the horizontal axis is the 2020 number of votes, and the vertical axis, the 2024 number of votes. The red line is, again, exactly the same number of votes cast for the Democrat in that county both years. And if you look on the upper right, I think even at a distance, you can see that the bubbles start to be a little bit below the diagonal line as you're looking at the places that cast a lot of Democratic votes last time. On the right is the same thing, but now we're looking at the number of Republican votes that were cast. And up in that upper right corner, those dots, those circles start to be a little bit above the diagonal line, meaning Republicans were gaining total votes, Democrats were losing total votes. To illustrate this, if you lived in a county that cast 1 million votes for one party, if they cast that 1 million votes for the Democrats, they cast only 954,000 votes for the Democrats this time. A drop off of whatever that is, 4.6 points. If it was a Republican county that got 1 million votes last time, this time they got 1,063,000 votes. So This is slightly different from the percentage change that we saw, but it suggests that turnout was playing a role. Now, we can never know whether some Democrats last time switched parties and voted Republican this time, or whether it was some Democrats chose to stay home and some Republicans turned out more. Undoubtedly, it's a mix of those two things. But the net effect is whether you're a huge county at 1 million votes or a medium-sized county at 100,000 or a small county at 10,000, in every one of those, the Democratic vote total went down, and in every one of those, the Republican vote total went up, on average. You say the election was close. How close was it? And in particular, what does the arrow point to? What was the closest state in the United States of America? Us. So we didn't end up being the pivotal state this year, which we were last time. Last time, if Trump had won Georgia and won Arizona, but still won Wisconsin, he would have lost the presidency. Did I say that right? If Trump had won Arizona and Georgia, but still lost Wisconsin, Biden would have still been elected president. We were the tipping point state. This year, that's not true. And the reason is Michigan and Pennsylvania, which were both more Democratic than we were last time, both jumped over us and became more Republican than we were this time. So as a result, Pennsylvania becomes the pivoting state, the pivot point state this time. That has more to do with them changing than with us changing. But you also just see here how incredibly close we are. This is also 3 elections in a row where the margin has been less than 1 percentage point here in Wisconsin. We have never since 1856 gone that many elections in a row and stayed that close for all 3. So Lynn Vavreck earlier in their book on the 2020 election coined the term calcification, that we're really not just polarized, but we're kind of stuck and we don't move a whole lot from one election to the next. But that little bit of movement is really consequential for tipping the race one way or another. With Wisconsin, you see it at the state level too. We gave Obama pretty good victories in 2008 and in 2012, but Trump won us by 0.7 of a point in 2016, lost us by 0.6 of a point in 2020, and now won us by 9/10 of a point this time. And so we just stay there. It's not because we aren't changing. You'll see some changes in a minute within the state, but the balance across the state has been really steady for quite a while. The House majority will certainly be Republican. It's going to be small. There was, when I updated this yesterday, there were still 3 House seats that hadn't yet been called. And some of those House Republican seats will be empty because Trump has appointed 3 members of the House to his cabinet. That includes Matt Gaetz, who of course dropped out of consideration, but said today he will not return to the House. Still, that would leave it at something like a 218 to 214 Republican majority pending special elections. And that's really hardly changed from where we were for the last 2 years with that very narrow Republican majority. The difference, of course, is with Trump in the White House, he's likely to be able to enforce a certain discipline on Republican House members that they didn't have over the last 2 years when they struggled to elect a speaker at the beginning and then they booted that speaker and struggled to pick a new speaker. So I think there will be rock'em sock'em action in the House, but I don't expect it to be the same kind of action where the certain members were able to block legislation that the leadership wanted to get through. I'm reasonably confident that if Trump wants something to get through, the party will coalesce on that something. In the Senate, a big flip from a 51-seat Democratic majority to a 53-seat Republican majority. You can say the Democrats managed to hold on with tight margins in Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and here. But But you can see Dem to Rep flips in Montana, a very red state, in Ohio, a state that used to be the battleground of the country, but now is so close. Pennsylvania, which is maybe a little bit more of the surprise, only in the sense that having voted for Biden last time, it flipped on the presidency, and also having elected Democratic senator last time, Democratic governor last time, flipped to a Republican senator. And West Virginia, which was a foregone conclusion with Joe Manchin's retirement, that state would certainly go Republican. And, you know, with Democratic holds in Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and here. Still leaves open the filibuster as an option for Democrats, at least on legislation that can be filibustered. They will still have that power. So I do expect a lot of struggle there. A notable thing, you just look at the right-hand side of this chart. This is whether the Republican Senate candidate overperformed or underperformed Trump in their state. And you can see those percentages are all negative. Those are all Republican candidates for the Senate doing less well than Trump did in their states. That didn't keep some of them from being elected, but it did help make some of them lose. And it's a pattern that we've seen for the last few years, that some of the most MAGA Senate candidates have struggled in states that otherwise Trump has won. And I think this time we see the same thing. It's just that it wasn't a large enough disadvantage to, say, keep Montana from flipping from Democrat to Republican. One last thing, it does maybe speak to the issue of how transferable is Trump's appeal. That people who like Trump because of who he is, how he talks, whatever it is, don't seem to gravitate to some of his companions in Senate races. And that is useful for thinking about what the next 2 years leads to in the Senate races then. And 4 years ahead, when Trump will be leaving office, how does he pass the mantle to future Republicans if it is more of a personalized appeal and not one that's, you know, the party label is enough to carry you over with? Here's Wisconsin's legislature. I was joking with Barry that we're finally going to get to the important stuff, the Wisconsin legislative races. As you know, we did redistricting this year and we got more competitive races, but we didn't flip either chamber to the Democrats. In the assembly side, we went from 64 Republican, 35 Democrat, though one of those seats was vacant. I'm counting it in the 35 as a Democratic seat. And now it's going to be 24 Republican, 45 Democrat. That's a pretty substantial drop from a Republican 29 seat majority to a Republican 10 seat majority. However, it does keep Speaker Robin Vos in his position as Speaker. It does mean that in these new districts that were formed, Republicans held on to some that Democrats had a reasonable hope of taking. In 2 years, will they have solidified their appeal in those districts by being the legislator, by doing, you know, Kiwanis Club meetings and going around and doing all the good things that legislators do to make themselves popular? Or will the midterm, which usually is not good for the president's party, make these more competitive than they were this time? I mean, they were competitive this time, but still fell short in the assembly. In the Senate, because only half of the Senate is up for election every 2 years, there was never much of a chance that Democrats could take the Senate. But it did flip from 22 to 11 Republican to just 18-15 Republican now. And of the seats that are up in 2 years and that look likely to be competitive, Democrats appear to have a substantial advantage in those seats. So whereas the assembly may stay in Republican hands in 2 years based on these members that managed to hold on to seats this time, for the Senate, it looks much more likely that it could flip to Democratic control. Certainly no guarantee. This is the vote for the assembly seats. Along the bottom to the left are districts that Trump won. To the right are districts that Harris won. Vertically, it's how much did the assembly outperform the presidential vote. And there's kind of a diagonal line you can see through there. That's the 50-50 point in the assembly seat. The main thing is, this is real risky to see if I can point to these. See these right here? There are 4 Republican seats here that Harris won the assembly district, but the Republican won the legislative seat. And up top, the 94th, up just north of La Crosse, is the one seat that Trump won and the Democrat won. So if you think of the balance between these, it's 4-1 Republicans winning in Harris districts to 1 Democrat winning in Trump districts. If you look at the Senate, it's more boring. There's not really anything that crosses the line, though there are a couple that are close. And these dots out here are seats that weren't up this time, but will be up next time. And you can see several of them are quite a ways out on the right in strong Harris districts. So that's sort of the basis of saying it seems at the very least clear that there'll be a very competitive Senate race in 2 years, state Senate race. Okay, let's look at the vote. So this is on the left, the presidential vote percentage by ward here in the state. My colleague John Johnson managed to collect all of these damn wards within 2 days of the election. Thank God for him doing it, not me. One thing you see on the left is our pretty usual pattern. You see very blue Milwaukee, and not just Madison and Dane County, but a lot of the surrounding areas pretty blue. You see a little smidgen of blue in La Crosse and up a little further north in Eau Claire. You kind of have to squint to see Wausau because the city of Wausau is a little Democratic, but all of the surrounding Marathon County is quite Republican. You can see Stevens Point. You can see up in Bayfield, Adams, or Ashland and Douglas counties, some remaining blue up there. Oh, and I left out Green Bay, which we should certainly mention, where the city of Green Bay has become pretty Democratic. So has some of the other larger communities in the Fox Valley. But you move even just a little bit out of those cities and you get into quite Republican suburbs and exurbs, let alone farm country. And then our favorite Door County, where the south is red and the north is blue, and ever it shall be.
Is that Menominee County?
Yes, the big blue blob there is Menominee, Indian area, but a tiny, tiny vote. Menominee casts like 1,000 votes, okay? And so it's incredibly blue because the percentage is incredibly Democratic, but the number of votes there is really, really tiny. Okay, on the right, though, is the change from 4 years ago to this year. And the color is on the same scale. So what is the first thing you see? The one on the right is incredibly pale. You know, you can barely make out that some of these wards got a little redder, though honestly, they just got a little pinker. Some got a little bluer. There is some mix there. It's not like the entire state moved in a Republican direction, but it's a mix, and the amount of movement is really, really small. Again, my colleague John Johnson went back and looked at how much Wisconsin's votes have changed from year to year. And we are seeing historically low levels of change at the ward level, going back at least 25 years to the 2000 election. So again, the point is very small movement, but just enough to be consequential to change Trump losing by 0.6 of a point to winning by 0.9 of a point, a shift of just 1.5 points on the margin. Here's the Baldwin race on the left. if you squint, you might think that she maybe expanded the blue around Madison just a little bit. On the right is the change from 6 years ago in her 2018 reelection. And there you see massive amounts of red. This is in some ways misleading. She won by 10.9 percentage points 6 years ago. She won by 0.9 of a point this year. And so naturally, you're going to see mostly red change. So I think the more revealing picture is the next one. And this is Baldwin versus Harris, or more correctly, it's the margin in the Senate race minus the margin in the presidential race. So blue is those wards voted a little more for Baldwin than they voted for Trump compared to 4 years ago. Or I'm sorry, yes, compared to Trump. So she outperformed the presidential ticket wherever you see blue. And it may not be very bright, but virtually the whole map is blue. So we talked a lot. You saw reporters talk about it throughout the spring and summer about Baldwin's trick for losing by less, by going into some of the more Republican areas of the state and doing a little better than other Democrats do in those areas. And I think you see it with this map really pretty nicely. She didn't wildly outperform the presidential ticket, but she didn't need to, right? Presidential went 0.9 of a point for Trump. Senate went 0.9 of a point for Baldwin, just a 1.8% difference. But I want to emphasize on this map that it's not just concentrated in one small area of the state. It's really widespread across the state in areas that are, typically redder areas and some that are typically bluer areas. Here it is at the county level, Harris minus Trump's margin. The margin here is showing you the counties that Harris won in blue, that Trump won in red. If you come down from the top, the first red dot is Sauk County. Sauk is now the only county that voted twice for Obama, once for Trump, once for Biden, and now they've gone back and voted the other way. I imagine that two people were on vacation during election week, but you can see just how close it is. If we go to the Senate campaign and you come down to the last blue dot, that's Sauk again. That's the closest county that Baldwin won. So it went just slightly for Trump and it went just slightly for Baldwin. All the other blue dots are the same. All the other red dots are the same. Very little change there. Where did Baldwin outperform the Trump race, the Senate race outperform the presidential race? This is, you've seen it in the map. Now you're seeing it by county. The thing that pops here is the bottom. In only 4 counties did Harris outperform Baldwin. And what were those counties? Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, and Menominee. Sorry, I know that. The WOW counties remain just a little less supportive of Trump than other similarly Republican counties around the state. And you can see it right here. Also, if we look at the trend over time, the WOW counties have been getting less and less Republican since 2010. And that's true across races. It's true for presidential races. It's true for gubernatorial races. Scott Walker did great there in 2010, fell slightly in the recall in 12, fell in 14, fell in 18. You look at the Supreme Court races, those counties are becoming slightly less supportive of conservative candidates for the court. So it's not just Donald Trump that people in those counties are less enamored with. Now, there's still Republican counties, don't get carried away on this, but there's a difference between Trump winning Waukesha by, I think it was 58% this time, and Scott Walker winning it a few years ago by well over the high 60s or the low 70s. So there's been a good deal of change. Net about 40,000 fewer votes for Republicans coming out of the WOW counties now than was the case in 2012. And of course, our margins were just 30,000 this time, just 20,000 last time. So these are consequential shifts, but they're somewhat made up by becoming more Republican in the north and west of the state. Since it was brought up by Eric Hovde, I wanted to show you the absentee vote in Milwaukee City. Now, this is just the city, not the county. But what you see, the Senate is there in the middle, not at the very top, is that on the election day vote in Milwaukee, Baldwin got 75% of that vote. Of the mail-in absentee vote, she got 82%. Hovde got 21.6% of election day, 16% of mail-in. So he certainly did a little bit worse in the mail-in absentee ballots. But we've been seeing this for a number of years. Democrats are more prone to vote by mail. Republicans have resisted that. And if you look at the very top, you can see how modest the difference is in the presidential. Trump got almost 81% of the, Harris got almost 81% of the mail absentee. Trump got 17%, but Hovde got 16.5%. So there's really very little difference in the shift between election day and absentee, or between voting for the Republican for president, voting for the Republican for Senate. So the takeaway from this is this looks like a pretty normal set of results for absentee votes, given what we've seen. College campuses. These are all of the wards in the state that are within 3/4 of a mile of the center of a campus. Not just a UW campus, but you can see Marquette's on here too. And the percent on the right is the percent for Trump. And you can see how that vote shifted over time. So here in Madison, from 17% in 2020 to 14%, but now up to 18% this time. That's a pretty modest change, but it is in keeping with what some of the polling and the exit polling showed, that young people weren't quite as strong for Harris. But then you look at others like UW-Stout or River Falls, we're up in the 40% range for Trump. Some of those are up a little bit. Not all of them are up a lot. UW-Oshkosh from 40 to 44, Whitewater from 38 to 43%. So we don't know for sure that all of these are student voters. They simply live in a ward that's walking distance from campus. But it's the best measure we can do at this point to try to estimate how did the student or younger vote shift. And if you put them all together, it's a modest change from 31% for Trump both 4 years ago and 8 years ago, up 3 points to 34%. And that's notable because the overall vote shifted by less than the young people's vote shifted by. A little bit about things that also were talked about earlier. What's happening with education, the diploma divide, as people sometimes call it. So again, we've taken all 3,500 some odd wards in the state. Since Kevin's here, I will say, technically they're reporting units, not wards. Some reporting units are more than one ward. But we've taken all of those and we've matched them to census data for the census characteristics. So in the wards in the lower quintile, the bottom 20% of college graduates in the state, look at the solid line right here. Trump won them by 2 points in 2016, by 7 points 4 years ago, and by 10 points this time. So continued inroads with lower education voters, the lowest in terms of this grouping. But the next, which is the 20th to the 40th percentile of education, also improved Trump's margins from 11 to 12 to 15. When you go to the middle level of education, we haven't seen a whole lot of trend there. Trump won that by 7, won it by 5, and then won it by 7 again this time. Though don't discount that, right? Small movements mattered this time. And then when you get to the second from the highest, there you see the reverse trend taking place. Trump won those in the 60th to the 80th percentile, won those by 2, then lost by 2 and lost by 1 this time. But if you look at the highest education levels, it goes from a 20-point Democratic lead to a 26 to 26 again this time. So we're seeing some growth of the education divide, but we're also seeing it change within level of education, not just across education levels. I'll just quickly say on the far left, this is income. So Democrats still do quite well in the lowest quintile of income. And they do tolerably well in the highest quintile of income. But they're losing all 3 in the middle 3 quintiles of income. We'll skip population density. Here's our best estimate of racial voting in the state. Again, what we're doing here is merging on the census data and dividing the wards into those wards that are majority Black wards anywhere in the state, not just in one area, anywhere in the state. And you can see that the Democratic majority has fallen from 84 to 81 to 79%. Still a very solid majority, but one that's shrinking just a little bit, maybe 5 points over 8 years. The Latino vote, though, has fallen from 61 Democratic majority to 52 to now 42, a 19-point decline in the size of the Democratic margin in those majority Latino wards. And finally, when you look at white non-Hispanic wards, majority wards, very little movement. Trump won them by 6 in 2016, won them by 4 in 2020, slightly less good. And this time he won them by 5, slightly better. And so not a lot of movement in the white vote, but a striking movement in the Hispanic wards, a modest but consistent decline in Black wards. Okay, now I wanted to show you a little bit of polling and then we'll wrap up. This is the 2-candidate vote trend over the year in the polls that I did, that the Marquette Law School poll did. We did 8 polls over this period. We had Biden ahead in some, we had Trump ahead in some, we had Harris slightly ahead or a little bit more ahead towards the end, but in the final poll, we had her up by just 1 percentage point. All of these polls were inside the margin of error. So portraying the state is really up for grabs, truly a battleground, I think fits well with the data that we have. Neither candidate ran away with it. The one thing that's missing here is the period between the Biden-Trump debate and the time Biden dropped out. If you look at other polling in the state, it looks pretty clear that Biden lost 3 or 4 percentage points in that month after the debate. Harris then quickly regained virtually all of Biden's losses. But the debate certainly did play a big role. In the Senate, we had Baldwin ahead virtually all the time. We had 1 tie back in the spring. And in the end, we had Baldwin up by 2. She ended up winning by 9/10 of a point. So we're off by 1.1 percentage points in the end. But she did look stronger earlier in the campaign, and that race does seem to have tightened at the end, something the Baldwin campaign itself said was going on. But this is the national forces. We've talked a lot about what structured this race. So this is the conclusion of this talk. This is Biden's job approval since he took office. The green line is approve of the job he's doing as president. And except for in the summer of 2021, he was below 50%. Actually, he was barely below 50 even in that first poll. But once he fell down into the low 40s, he never moved out of the low 40s the entire term. That's a big problem. We also started, we were rather late to do this, but during the spring and summer and fall, we asked, thinking back to when Trump was president, did you approve or disapprove of the job he did then? And here's that. More people disapprove of Trump than approve, but compare Biden's big gap between those with Trump's rather narrow gap between them. So it wasn't as if people remembered a wonderful time under Trump. They were a little bit net negative. In point of fact, at the very end, this was 47-52, 47 approved, 52 disapproved. That was exactly what we had in the last October poll before the 2020 election. So the idea that people were looking back with rose-colored glasses at his term, I don't think that holds up. They were seeing him in this recall question just exactly the way they saw him 4 years ago. But the main thing is this big negative evaluation of Biden was guaranteed to be a drag on any Democratic candidate, let alone his vice president. We've talked a lot about the economy, and I think this is, of the data we collect, the one that I put the most emphasis on. This is asking, how is your family's financial situation these days? Are you living comfortably? Are you just getting by? Or are you struggling? So the green line is living comfortably. And you can see that throughout Trump's administration, all 4 years really. Sorry, I said that wrong. Clearly for the last 2 years, around 60% or a little more said they were living comfortably. Now, for the last 18 months, it's been 44, 45% living comfortably. So there's a big decline there. And it's not because people are misremembering, because this is what they said at the time we interviewed them at each poll. And even in the first 2 years of Trump's administration, it was over 50% saying they were living comfortably. So this is the impact of inflation, surely, maybe the aftermath of the pandemic. But I want to stress that in this current population, you have to be about 55 or a little older to have lived through the last round of high inflation as an adult. Now, yes, you might have been 12 or 13 when inflation was high in the early 80s. But to really experience it as an adult, you got to be pretty far along here. And I think the implication of that is that inflation, which was not as high as what we lived through in the late 70s, early 80s, was nevertheless the first experience of pretty high inflation for a big chunk of the current generation. And so I think that's another element that was playing a role. Right direction, wrong track. Green is right direction, purple is wrong track. And again, you can see that during much of Trump's administration, people said we were headed in the right direction. But throughout the Biden administration, wrong track has been higher, consistently higher. Finally, there's been a little shift of partisanship. We go all the way back to 2012 when we first started the Marquette poll. Democrats outnumbered Republicans by about 3 or sometimes 4 percentage points. People saying 3 or 4% more said they were Democrat than said they were Republican. Then in the teens, that tightened a bit, and it stayed quite tight through the teens and the early 20s. And in this year, it's moved a little bit more in the Republican direction to about a 3 to 5 point Republican advantage. It didn't get a whole lot of play, but late in the fall, I don't mean late October, but I mean late September, national polling was talked about that had also seen this kind of shift, a modest but persistent increase in Republican partisanship. And we see that here. And as you can see, it's not just one poll that showed that difference. It's basically every poll we did this year and part of last year that showed this bit of movement in a GOP direction. We'll see with a Republican president whether that sustains itself or goes away. Most important issue, the economy. This also drives that home. In the end, 39% said the economy was most important. Just 15% said abortion policy was most important. And just behind that, 13% immigration and border security. But if we ask which candidate is better on whichever issue the voter says is most important to them? The red line. Donald Trump was seen as better on that issue, most important to the voters. Throughout the period after Biden dropped out, it was more of a mixed picture with Biden and Trump before Biden dropped out. And so you put together negative perceptions of the economy, the perception that that's very important, the perception that Trump is better on that issue. And I think you're seeing a pretty clear pattern of why people would, in the end, vote for Trump. Now, there were other things. Personality, Harris had advantages. She was seen as having a better temperament to be president. She was seen as being more honest, as more intelligent, though Trump was seen as having a stronger record of accomplishments. So on the personal side, the feelings tip a little bit to Harris, but on the issue side, even across most of these issues, they tip towards Trump. And so that's where we ended up with a very, very close election here, less close in Michigan and Pennsylvania. And Biden lost Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, which were so important for him in 2020. So thank you much.
So, Charles, I want to, as these questions are coming in, ask about this smaller shift to the right in Wisconsin relative to, let's say, Pennsylvania and Georgia. And before I give my question, I have to say, when Bernard said, "Oh, Georgia, battleground state," it was like, welcome to the club. Wisconsin's been in this club for many, many years. So a smaller shift. Craig Gilbert, who you've worked with, when he wrote this up in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, he talked about it as a purple ripple. And I'm curious if there's something about Wisconsin, if it's something about the kind of the features of the 2024 election that might explain why Wisconsin didn't shift as much. Two kind of, well, maybe three come to mind. One is there's just something about Wisconsin and our political culture or our political history. Second is this evidence of reverse coattails with Baldwin. And the third is about the new legislative maps. Yeah. And does this mean that there were places perhaps that had more campaign activity from Democrats that maybe would not have had, either with Baldwin not running or with these state maps? I have a follow-up to this, but I'll kick that one first over to you.
I think, the legislative maps obviously mattered because they shifted the balance considerably. They didn't flip the majority in the legislature, but I think it was not impossible, but it was a bit of a long shot to completely flip both chambers this time. Really was not in the cards. Still, I'd point out those 4 districts that Republicans won even as Harris was winning. And I think those are interesting places to go and understand a little bit, plus the 1 district that the Democrat won while Trump was winning that district. The other thing we see here in the state about why we stay so close is that there's been a great deal of change over the last 20 years, but it's hidden. So in 2004, John Kerry won the state by, again, under 1 percentage point. And you see the north and west of the state was generally light blue with some light red. Go forward 20 years to the 2020 election, whatever that is, 16 years? Anyway, go to 2020. And also an incredibly close race, decided by 0.6 of a point. But the north and west is now quite red. And the southeast is less red than it used to be. And in the cities, they're bluer than they used to be. So there actually is a lot of change taking place under the hood. But you have to drill down to the localities to see that. And I don't think it's a natural law, but we certainly see that for each action in the moving to the left, we're seeing action moving to the right as well. And the result is we're now at 5 out of the last 7 elections decided by less than 1 percentage point, presidential elections. You had a follow-up.
I did. And you know what? You answered it.
Great.
You're just so masterful in your sense of Wisconsin's political geography. I was curious about trends over time.
Yeah.
So we've got some questions here. One we haven't really talked about at all today, so I'd like to get your take. Did Vance or Walz have any impact?
Yeah. I think very little, because in general, I think vice presidents don't tip elections much. Vance's favorability actually did improve after the vice presidential debate. Walz went slightly less positive, but Walz, in the first 3 polls we did with him in the race, was the only candidate with a net favorable rating. That fell to like a point negative in the final poll, whereas Vance had been at like negative 11 points more unfavorable than favorable. He pulled up to close to even in that last poll. So I don't think that moved the vote very much, but there was a little bit of a shift in the perceptions of them. We also checked to see if the counties in Wisconsin that are part of Minnesota media markets, like the Twin Cities or Duluth Superior, or places like La Crosse, where candidates in Minnesota advertise on the La Crosse stations. We found that Walz was just a little bit better known in those counties, but he wasn't better liked particularly. So I don't think there was that sort of just across the river effect for us.
Great. One other question that I think speaks to something that we haven't talked about yet today. I was really struck by the graph that you put up showing vote share for Trump for those wards by college campuses. So there was someone in the audience that also was struck by those. And, based on the student voting data, but maybe also polling data from the Marquette Law School poll, what can you say about younger voters in this election?
Yeah. One thing is that younger voters weren't wildly different from other people in the sense that what was the most important problem for voters under 30 was the economy. Younger voters were concerned. You think about the impact of your rent going up if you're 21. I think that was not, in some sense, really surprising that there was that concern. Now, younger voters were more concerned about abortion policy than older voters were, so there were other factors at play. And in the end, while Trump was seen as better on the economy by about 10 points better than Harris among the whole public, among young voters, Harris was seen as 2 points better than Trump on the economy. But that's a tiny sliver of an advantage rather than a real base for support. It'll be a while till we have some idea about whether turnout stayed similar to where it has been, went up or went down, so I can't say much about that. I will say this, and we'll never know, but it's the change that took place. In our national polling that we do, through the spring, voters under 30 were the most Democratic in their partisan identification. They were the most liberal or progressive of any age group, and they had the lowest job approval of Joe Biden. So if you think of setting the table in the way that I was showing you Biden's low job approval, concern about the economy over time, that was a tough audience to see Democrats pick up what they think is their natural support among younger voters.
That's great. We have several questions. I'm going to just kind of summarize them very quickly here. They're all about polling methodology. You knew those questions were coming, right? I
teach that class in the spring. You can sign up and do 16 weeks on polling methodology.
So folks are curious about kind of what's changed. Obviously, the shift toward more online polls and, people don't have landlines. So if you can just say a little bit.
Yeah, and we've changed. from 2012 through 2022, we did telephone polls with live interviewers. We called numbers at random, meaning you take the area code and the exchange, and then you add a random 4-digit number to that. That gives every phone, whether a landline or a cell phone, an equal chance to be picked and sampled. But response rates have been going down because people don't answer their phones. And so as a purely practical matter, that meant that in 2022, we were getting a much smaller response rate than we had in 2012. And while the 2022 results were actually pretty good, our error on the two races was 2.2 points, which happened to be exactly what the long-term error was. So it wasn't that it didn't work, but it worried me quite a bit that we were getting such a small fraction of the sample that things could go badly with just a little bit more slippage. And costs went up like 20, 30% in just 22 alone because you had to pay interviewers to sit there and keep dialing numbers when less than 1 in 100 got picked up when we called. So starting in, by the way, that's normal. That, if anything, we're slightly above the national average in that, as terrible as that is. So in 2023, we switched to sampling from the registered voter list. That's great advantage because we know everybody on the list is, in fact, registered to vote. We know where they live because that's part of the voter file. And so what we're able to do this time in 23 and all through this year is we sample people from that voter list, but first we sort the list from the most Republican, Trumpiest places in the state to the most Democratic places in the state. And then we divide it into 90 different places, groups. And we're making all the effort we can to make sure we're getting the right proportion of people from very Republican areas and from swing areas and from Democratic areas. With the telephone poll, because we didn't know where people lived, we just knew their number. We couldn't do that kind of fine-grained stratification of the sample. We then send an email and a text message, both with links to complete the survey online, telling them this is the Marquette poll, please do this poll, and saying, here's an email address. If you have questions, you can write with any questions. Our response rate went up a fair bit this year. People seem to be a little more responsive to that. We're not having to get through the won't pick up the phone problem. If we don't hear from someone in a day or two after a reminder, we then call them. So the result is we're doing 80% of interviews online, and about 20% are still done on the telephone with a live interviewer. But that 20% got the email and got the text and got the reminder before we call. So maybe that's also playing a little bit of a role in getting a better response rate. The result was this year we were off by 1.9 points on the presidential. We were off by 1.1 points on the Senate. So that's a little better than that 2.2 long-term average, and it actually brings our long-term error rate to 2.1 points after this election. So we did a little better. We still had Harris leading at the end by 1, but with a 4.4 margin of error, which every time I talked about it, I said this race is truly too close to call. So that's what happened with us. And a lot of pollsters have made similar kinds of changes. Not everybody, but a lot.
So I know we're at time, and Barry's going to come up. But before he comes up, I'm going to ask you 2 quick questions. You can answer one or both. One, it's always election season here in Wisconsin. So the first question is there a trend or some sort of data point that you'll be paying attention to? And second, you have been polling Wisconsinites for over a decade. And I'm curious what your favorite question is that you've asked Wisconsin voters over all of these years?
Yeah, we're still going to be asking questions. I think my favorite questions, honestly, are ones that we asked primarily in 2020, though they're included in the new poll that we're putting in the field in a couple of weeks. A national poll, not a state poll, but it may show up in the state too. And that's just an open-ended question that says, is there anything you like about Donald Trump? Is there anything you dislike about Donald Trump? Two separate questions. And of course you get answers that are, I like everything and there's nothing I don't like. And you also get the, there's nothing I like about him and I dislike everything about him. I don't mean to specifically pick on Trump. You get similar kinds of things with Democratic politicians. But one of the things we do is let you read what those open-ended responses were, and you can sort them by partisanship, by age, by race, by region of the state. And I think that's actually a really interesting way to get a feel for what people are thinking when they answer that kind of question. So that's pretty high up on my list.
All right. With that, please join me in thanking Charles Franklin.
Thank you.
Yeah, just stay seated and we'll keep it short and sweet. This ends the 2024 Election Symposium. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience and making it a terrific, if a little long day. I think it was worth the payoff to hang around till 4:30 in the afternoon. If you're interested in the work of the Elections Research Center, I'll just remind you we have a website, we have social media feeds, and we have a newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter on the website, elections.wisc.edu. You can follow us on social media to keep up with presentations, awards, activities, other things that are happening in the center. The center also depends entirely on private gifts, and if you were interested in supporting us financially, we would, of course, welcome that. Thank you again, and hope to see you all back here in exactly 2 years. Have a great weekend.